We need to talk about what's happening in New York City right now because it is absolutely extraordinary. And I have to tell you, there's a part of me that finds this whole situation darkly amusing. You see, the chickens are coming home to roost for Zohran Mamdani and his own supporters. The very people who knocked on doors for him, who donated their hard-earned money to his campaign, who believed every single word of his radical promises. They're now standing outside his mansion with megaphones screaming shame. Let me paint you a picture of what happened just days ago. Protesters gathered outside Gracie Mansion. That's the official residence of the New York City mayor, one of the most prestigious addresses in America. And they weren't Republicans, they weren't conservatives. These were his own people, his own voters, and they were furious. Now, the immediate trigger was the release of new Epstein files by the Justice Department. And wouldn't you know it, Mamdani's mother, filmmaker Miri Niri, was mentioned in these documents. She attended an after-party back in 2009 at Ghislaine Maxwell's townhouse. Bill Clinton was there, Jeff Bezos was there. All the usual suspects from that disturbing social circle. And before anyone jumps down my throat, no, there's no allegation of wrongdoing against his mother. That's not the point I'm making here. The point is that these protesters, these true believers in the socialist revolution, they're standing outside yelling through megaphones. We know about your mom. We voted for you, Zohran. We advocated for you. You lied, Zohran. Shame. But here's what makes this absolutely delicious from a political standpoint. The Epstein connection. That's just the cherry on top. The real story, the real reason for this buyer's remorse goes so much deeper. These protesters aren't just angry about his mother being at some Hollywood party 15 years ago. They're angry because they're starting to realize they got played. They're starting to understand that Zohran Mamdani sold them a bill of goods, made promises he never intended to keep. And now that he's got the job, now that he's sitting in that office, suddenly all those radical positions are flexible. Let me take you through this piece by piece because this is a masterclass in political deception and it's important that people understand exactly what happened here. Zohran Mamdani ran as a democratic socialist. He's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, which is the largest socialist organization in the country. They claim over 80,000 members. And during his campaign, Mamdani promised them the moon. Free buses, frozen rents, universal childcare, government-run grocery stores, tax the rich into oblivion, dismantle the police. He was going to turn New York City into a socialist paradise. And you know what? His base ate it up. The DSA mobilized between 90,000 and 100,000 volunteers for this campaign. Think about that number. In a city of 9 million people, they got 100,000 true believers to go door to door, make phone calls, organize rallies. Bernie Sanders came and campaigned for him. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez headlined his events. This was going to be the big one. This was going to prove that socialism could work in America. Right there in the heart of capitalism, in the financial capital of the world. Mamdani won the Democratic primary with 56% of the vote, defeating none other than Andrew Cuomo, former governor, Democratic establishment royalty. Then he won the general election, becoming at 34 years old the youngest mayor in New York City history and the first Muslim mayor. Historic, groundbreaking. The media couldn't get enough of it. But here's where it gets interesting. Almost immediately after the election, even before he was sworn in, the cracks started showing and his radical base started getting nervous. First, he announced he was keeping Jessica Tisch as NYPD commissioner. Now, Jessica Tisch is a billionaire, a literal billionaire, a Bice. She's from the Tisch family, you know, the ones with their name on buildings all over New York. She was the architect of the NYPD's massive surveillance infrastructure. Under her watch, the department cracked down hard on protests against the Gaza conflict. She represents everything these democratic socialists claim to oppose. Wealth, police power, the surveillance state. And what does Mamdani do? He keeps her on, gives her his full support, says he appreciates her work and the work of the NYPD. Now remember, this is the same Zohran Mamdani who tweeted in June 2020, "We don't need an investigation to know that the NYPD is racist, anti-queer, and a major threat to public safety. What we need is to defund the NYPD." That's a direct quote. He called for defunding the police. He said they were a major threat to public safety. In another tweet from 2020, after someone claimed they saw a police officer crying in his car, Mamdani responded with, "Nature is healing," mocking a police officer's pain. That's who this guy was when he was trying to win over the radical left. He even promised to disband the Strategic Response Group, That's the NYPD's elite unit that handles riots, civil disorder, mass shootings. In December 2024, while already a candidate for mayor, he tweeted that he would disband the SRG because it had brutalized countless New Yorkers exercising their First Amendment rights. So what happened? Did Mamdani have some kind of epiphany? Did he suddenly realize that maybe, just maybe, a city of 9 million people needs a functioning police force? Or did he just tell his radical base exactly what they wanted to hear to get elected, knowing full well he'd never follow through? I think we all know the answer to that question, but it gets better. In January, just days after being sworn in as mayor, there were 2 fatal police shootings in one night, one in Brooklyn, one in Manhattan. Both involve people in mental health crisis, and you have to understand this was a huge test for Mamdani. His entire campaign was built around the idea of creating a Department of Community Safety to handle mental health calls instead of armed police officers. He promised his supporters that he would fundamentally transform how the city responds to people in crisis. So what did he say when these shootings happened? He praised the police. He said officers were placed in incredibly difficult and dangerous circumstances and that they responded swiftly. Police Commissioner Tisch went even further, calling the officers' actions nothing short of heroic. One of those shootings involved a 22-year-old Bangladeshi immigrant named J.Z. Chakraorty. His family called 911 asking for an ambulance because their son was experiencing severe emotional distress. Instead of medical responders, NYPD officers showed up and shot him at least 4 times in front of his family. The family says that while their son was lying shot on the floor, police interrogated them about what country they were from, treated them like suspects, and confiscated their phones. Mamdani's response: support for the police, appreciation for their difficult work. His own supporters were absolutely livid. One comment that got over 40,000 likes on social media said, "Zohran blew it to levels I thought he'd wait at least 2 years for. Outrageous. He owes a huge apology to the Chakraborty family and to his supporters who elected a mayor who promised not to unleash state violence on people struggling with mental illness." Another user wrote, "Zohran, when ICE executes people in the street, this is horrific and unacceptable, literally murder. Zohran, when NYPD shoots someone, yet again, hey, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much." You see the pattern here? When it's politically convenient to bash law enforcement, when it's ICE agents, or when it's a campaign and he needs the radical vote, Mamdani is all about police brutality and state violence. But the moment he's actually responsible for running a city, the moment he has to deal with the real-world consequences of his radical ideology, suddenly he's singing a very different tune. And then, oh, this is my favorite part. In November, before he was even inaugurated, Mamdani went to Washington. He met with President Trump in the Oval Office, and by all accounts, it was a friendly meeting. Trump came out afterwards and said they agreed on many issues. Trump actually complimented Mamdani, saying he was finally being honest about the fiscal disaster that Eric Adams left behind. Can you imagine the Democratic Socialist mayor of New York City, the guy who was supposed to be the great resistance to Trump, having a cozy meeting in the Oval Office? His base was beside themselves. They felt betrayed, they felt used, and they were right to feel that way. Now, here's where it gets into the policy details. And this is important because it shows you that the betrayal isn't just symbolic, it's substantive. Mamdani ran on very specific promises. Free bus service, that was the signature campaign pledge. He was going to make all public transit free. Well, Governor Kathy Hochul came out and said, absolutely not. She's not going to greenlight that plan. She said, and I quote, "I cannot set forth a plan right now that takes money out of a system that relies on the fares of the buses and the subways." And what did Mamdani do? He backed down, just accepted it. The free buses that he promised his supporters, not happening. He also promised to tax the rich. Big tax increases on anyone making over $1 million a year. That was going to pay for all his programs. But again, Hochul stepped in and said she wouldn't allow the state tax increases he wanted. So now Mamdani is in a position where he can't fund his programs, and he's having to tell his supporters that nothing is actually free. And let me tell you, those supporters are shocked. They're developing serious buyer remorse because it turns out, surprise, surprise, that you can't just promise everyone free everything without having any realistic plan to pay for it. The socialists are learning the hard way that reality doesn't bend to ideology. But wait, there's more. Mamdani also promised government-run grocery stores. He said the city would create its own grocery chain to compete with private supermarkets and bring down prices. Now, anyone with even a basic understanding of economics knows this is insane. Government-run enterprises are notoriously inefficient. They lose money, they become corrupt. But Mamdani promised it anyway because it sounded good to his base. Guess how many government grocery stores he's opened so far? 0. Guess how many he's announced plans to open? 0. It was all talk, all campaign rhetoric. And now his supporters are realizing they got conned. The DSA itself is starting to fracture over Mamdani. You have different factions within the organization fighting about whether they should have ever supported him in the first place. There's a faction called the Marxist Unity Group that actually argued before his campaign that Mamdani should not run to win. They said he should run an agitational campaign to promote socialist ideas, but that he shouldn't actually try to become mayor because that would force him to compromise with the capitalist system. And you know what? They were right. That's exactly what happened. Mamdani got into office and reality hit him like a freight train. He realized he couldn't abolish the police. He realized he couldn't just print money to pay for free everything. He realized that running a city of 9 million people is actually complicated and requires pragmatism, not ideology. So now you have these different socialist factions tearing each other apart. Some are saying Mamdani betrayed the movement. Others are saying the movement needs to be more realistic. Some are calling him Zion, a disgusting anti-Semitic portmanteau that combines his name with Zionist, because they don't think he's been radical enough on Israel and Palestine. Speaking of which, let's talk about Mamdani's position on Israel, because this is another area where he's been trying to have it both ways. During the campaign, he was extremely critical of Israel. He called what's happening in Gaza a genocide. He supported the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. He led chants at anti-Israel protests organized by groups that openly support terrorism. In May 2021, he led a chant up supporting BDS at a protest organized by Within Our Lifetime, which is a pro-terror activist group that has incited violence against Jews. In October 2023, he was arrested for disorderly conduct while participating in an anti-Israel protest, blocking traffic outside a senator's home. In February 2024, he gave a speech at an anti-Israel protest where he railed against AIPAC, saying they were suppressing American public sentiment and subverting American democracy. But then, and this is fascinating, when he posted the video of that speech on Instagram, he edited out the parts about AIPAC because he knew it would look bad. That's political calculation right there. Say the radical things to fire up the base, but try to hide them from the broader public. And now that he's mayor, Mamdani is trying to moderate his positions on Israel. He's promised to combat anti-Semitism. He said that Israel has a right to exist, though notably, he won't say it has a right to exist as a Jewish state. He's trying to thread this impossible needle where he keeps his radical supporters happy while also not alienating Jewish voters in a city where Jews make up a significant portion of the population. But here's the thing, you can't have it both ways forever. Eventually, people on both sides figure out that you're playing them, and that's exactly what's happening now. The protest outside Gracie Mansion over the Epstein files connection, that's just the visible manifestation of a much deeper problem. Mamdani's coalition is falling apart. The radicals feel betrayed because he's not radical enough. The moderates are scared because he's still too radical. The business community is in panic mode. And ordinary New Yorkers are starting to ask themselves what exactly they voted for. You know, when Mamdani was sworn in, he took the oath of office on the Quran. The media celebrated this as historic, which fine, it's America. People can swear on whatever religious text they want. But then in his inaugural address, he said, "I will not abandon my principles for fear of being deemed radical." Well, it's been barely a month and he's already abandoned quite a few of those principles. He's abandoned the principle of defunding the police. He's abandoned the principle of dismantling police units. He's abandoned the principle of holding police accountable for shootings. He's abandoned the principle of refusing to work with the Trump administration. And now his own supporters are standing outside his mansion. His mansion, mind you, Gracie Mansion, which is quite a nice place for a socialist to be living. And they're calling him a liar. They're saying he tricked them. They're saying shame on him. And you know what? They're absolutely right. He did trick them. He told them exactly what they wanted to hear to get their votes and their volunteer hours and their donations. And now that he's got the power, he's governing like a normal politician. Maybe slightly to the left of center, but nowhere near the radical transformation he promised. Let me tell you about some of the other appointments he's made, because they tell you everything you need to know about who Mamdani really is. He appointed C.O. Weaver as director of the mayor's office to protect tenants. Now, Weaver has some interesting views. In August 2019, she tweeted, "Private property, including and kind of especially home ownership, is a weapon of white supremacy masquerading as wealth-building public policy. Private property is white supremacy. That's what his appointee believes. That's the kind of person he's putting in positions of power." And when this tweet resurfaced and people criticized it, what did Mamdani do? He defended her. He said he was proud to have her on his team. But then at the same time, he's also appointed people from the administrations of Michael Bloomberg, Bill de Blasio, and Eric Adams. He's put together this transition team full of Democratic Party insiders, Wall Street-friendly advisors, people who represent exactly the kind of establishment politics he was supposed to be running against. So which is it? Is he a radical who believes private property is white supremacy? Or is he a pragmatist who's going to work with billionaire police commissioners and Wall Street bankers? The answer is he's trying to be both, and it's not working. There's actually a really good analysis piece that compared Mamdani to Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago. Johnson also ran as a progressive, as a socialist-aligned candidate backed by the teachers' union. He promised transformative change. And you know what happened? His approval rating fell to 6.6%. 6.6%. 6%. That's almost impossible to achieve. But he managed it because he couldn't deliver on his promises. He alienated the city council, and he ended up being neither fish nor fowl. Too radical for moderates, too moderate for radicals. That's the path Mamdani is on right now, and we're only a month into his administration. Imagine what it's going to look like in a year, in 2 years, in 4 years. The fundamental problem, and this is something conservatives have been saying forever, is that socialism doesn't work. It doesn't work in theory, and it certainly doesn't work in practice. You can promise people free everything. You can promise them that you're going to soak the rich and redistribute wealth and create a worker's paradise. But when you actually have to govern, when you actually have to balance a budget, when you actually have to deal with public safety and economic development and all the complicated trade-offs that come with running a city, your ideology crashes into reality. And that's what we're watching happen in real time with Zohran Mamdani. Now, let me address something that some people might be thinking. They might say, well, isn't it good that he's moderating? Isn't it good that he's not following through on his radical promises? Shouldn't conservatives be happy about this? And look, on one level, yes. Am I glad that he's not actually defunding the police? Absolutely. Am I relieved that he's keeping experienced leadership at the NYPD? Sure. Am I happy that he's not turning New York into some kind of socialist experiment? You bet. But here's the problem. This is fundamentally dishonest politics. This is lying to voters. This is saying whatever you need to say to get elected and then governing however you want once you're in office. And that kind of cynical manipulation of the democratic process should concern everyone, regardless of their political affiliation. The people who voted for Mamdani deserve to get what they voted for, even if what they voted for was misguided. They deserve a mayor who actually believes in the things he said he believed in during the campaign. And if he can't deliver on those promises, he should be honest about why, not just quietly abandon them and hope people don't notice. But more than that, this whole saga shows the bankruptcy of socialist ideology. Because what we're seeing is that even the true believers, even the people who are committed democratic socialists, they can't actually implement their vision when they get power. They either fail spectacularly like we've seen in other countries, or they moderate and become basically standard liberals with radical rhetoric. Mamdani is choosing the latter path. He's keeping the rhetoric. He still talks about fighting for the working class and taking on the billionaires, but his actions are those of a conventional Democrat. Maybe a bit to the left, but nothing revolutionary, nothing transformative. And his base knows it. They can see it happening. That's why they're protesting outside his house. That's why there's this growing sense of buyer's remorse. You know what's really striking to me? The contrast between what Mamdani promised and what he's actually doing reminds me of every socialist experiment in history. You start with these grand promises of equality and justice and workers' power, and then you end up with a bureaucracy that's just as corrupt and inefficient as what came before. Except now it's harder to change because it's all wrapped up in the language of social justice. Mamdani promised to create a Department of Community Safety that would respond to mental health calls instead of police. Noble goal, right? We all want people in crisis to get help rather than getting shot. But here's the thing, it's really complicated. Who responds when someone is having a mental health crisis and is also armed with a knife? Who responds when that person is threatening to hurt themselves or others? You need people trained in both mental health intervention and in tactical response. You need resources, training, coordination. Mamdani promised this grand vision but didn't have a realistic plan to implement it. And when real situations arose, like the Chakraorty shooting, he fell back on supporting the traditional police response because that's what exists. That's what's functional, even if it's imperfect. That's the difference between campaigning and governing. Campaigning is about vision and inspiration. Governing is about details and trade-offs. And socialists are really good at the former but terrible at the latter. Let me tell you about the fiscal situation Mamdani is walking into, because this is where the rubber really meets the road. He announced that New York City faces a budget shortfall of $12.6 billion over the next 2 fiscal years. That's billion with a B. The city's total budget is around $115 to $120 billion, so we're talking about a massive hole. Now, Mamdani is blaming this all on Eric Adams, saying Adams hid the true fiscal situation from voters. And look, Adams had his problems, no question, but the deficit isn't just because of one corrupt mayor. It's because New York City spends too much money on things that don't work well. It's because the city has massive pension obligations. It's because taxes are already high and businesses are fleeing. So how is Mamdani going to fill this budget hole while also implementing all his new programs? Free buses cost money, universal child care costs money, government grocery stores cost money. Where is it all coming from? He wanted to tax the rich, but the governor said no. He wanted to cut certain services, but his progressive base says no. He's stuck. He's in an impossible position. And that's before we even talk about the fact that if you raise taxes too much, wealthy people and businesses just leave. They go to Florida, they go to Texas, they go anywhere that isn't going to confiscate half their income. This is basic economics, but socialists don't want to hear it. They think they can just will reality to be different. They think if they pass the right laws and create the right programs, somehow the money will materialize and everything will work out. It won't. And when it doesn't, when the programs fail or never materialize in the first place, who gets blamed? Not socialism, not the ideology. It's always that they didn't do it right, or they didn't go far enough, or the opposition sabotaged them. It's never that the fundamental approach is flawed. I want to circle back to the protesters outside Gracie Mansion because I think they're actually onto something important, even if they're coming at it from the wrong angle. They're recognizing that they've been lied to. They're recognizing that political promises don't always translate into political reality. They're experiencing the disappointment that comes from believing in a utopian vision that can never be realized. Now, they're drawing the wrong conclusion. They think the problem is that Mamdani isn't radical enough. They think if he just tried harder, if he just believed more fervently, if he just was willing to really fight the power structure, then somehow all their dreams would come true. But that's not it. The problem isn't insufficient radicalism. The problem is that the entire worldview is based on false premises. It's based on the idea that you can centrally plan an economy and have it work better than markets. It's based on the idea that you can redistribute wealth without killing the incentive to create wealth in the first place. It's based on the idea that government bureaucrats can make better decisions about how to run businesses than entrepreneurs and business owners. None of that is true. It's been tried dozens of times in dozens of countries and it's failed every single time. Sometimes it fails catastrophically with famine and oppression. Sometimes it fails more gradually with stagnation and decline, but it always fails. The protesters outside Mamdani's house should be learning a different lesson. They should be learning that the smooth-talking politician who promises you everything is probably lying. They should be learning that free stuff isn't free. They should be learning that radical transformation usually leads to catastrophe. They should be learning that incremental improvement based on what actually works is better than revolutionary change based on ideology. But they won't learn those lessons. They'll just find a new hero, a new movement, a new promise of utopia, and the cycle will